live from noon to 3 p.m. Eastern. Go to booktv.org for the complete weekend schedule.
Thank you very much, Reza. Thank you, all of you, for coming here tonight, and it really, truly is a privilege for me to introduce Medea to all of you. She's the reason that I'm on all of these committees, on all of these, the reason that I am a part of the peace movement in Fresno. Because in 2012, when she came to speak to us about her drone warfare book, I joined the movement. I joined the group out on the street, and I no longer was that person who occasionally went to the Bay Area, and I no longer was an armchair activist. So thank you, Medea. A little bit about her. She has been involved for 40 years. This small woman has a voice of equal rights, social justice for the entire world. Is that better? No? That's the one. I apologize. I will not start again. So Medea has received the Martin Luther King Jr. Peace Prize from the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the Marjorie Kellogg National Peacemaker Award, the Thomas Merton Center Peace Award, the Peace Foundation Memorial Award in recognition for her creative leadership on the front lines of the anti-war movement, and the Gandhi Peace Award from Promoting Enduring Peace. She's the co-founder of the woman-led peace group CodePink. That's why we all wear our pink in honor of her. That group began to fight against the war in Iraq. It's still fighting. With CodePink, she has found creative ways to continue to protest and bring awareness in a nonviolent way as our government has become more and more violent. She has been all over the world, but with CodePink, she's brought awareness to the drone issues. So she's been in Pakistan and Yemen to fight for those innocent people, children, women, men who have been killed by our drones. That's how she brought awareness to me first and to several of us here in Fresno. She has also spent time in Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Iraq. When she interrupted President Obama's speech while she was being carried out, he said, "That voice we all need to hear." He may oppose what she was saying, but that voice we get to hear tonight. With Israel and Palestine, she's taken numerous delegations to Gaza. She's been part of the Freedom Flotilla. She's been arrested and deported in her attempts to go there and hurt. She has been in Bahrain, tear gassed, arrested, and deported as well. She was part of the Tahrir Square uprising in Egypt. Go to CodePink. See what she's all about. On behalf of the Islamic Cultural Center, Peace Fresno, Fresno Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the Human Rights Coalition of the Central Valley, Palestine Freedom Project, and the Fresno Center for Nonviolence, and Progressive Democrats of America. I didn't forget you. I present to you Medea Benjamin.
So wonderful to be here and see such a beautiful crowd tonight. Just because we might have a certain gentleman called Donald Trump in the White House, it actually means we got to do more organizing than ever before So I want to make sure I pass around that sign-up sheet right there for CodePink. And for any viewers, we say that go to CodePink.org. This is the time to make sure that people who haven't been involved get involved. And I also want to say that it is a great honor to be speaking in this Islamic Cultural Center tonight. I thank the Imam, I thank Teresa, and especially important to be here when we talk about Saudi Arabia. You know, I'm of Jewish background and have done a lot of work on the injustices of the Israeli government towards the Palestinians. And many people in my family would always say to me, why are you always picking on Israel? What about all those Arab countries that are so repressive? And indeed, I've been working on a lot of issues in very repressive Arab countries, but there's the big one, the elephant in the room, Saudi Arabia, that I just kind of turned away from. And I realized that it was not wanting to get involved in a Shia-Sunni split that I didn't really understand, and more importantly, not wanting to feed into the Islamophobia that has been so terrible in our country and our projection around the world. We wouldn't be able to kill people with our drones in Muslim countries thousands of miles away were it not for deep racism within our country. And especially during Donald Trump's campaign, and now who knows what's going to happen in the White House, it's we have to be very careful about how we look at issues related to Islam. And that's why I'm so glad that Reza started us out looking at some of the pictures of Saudi Arabia and putting in the context that my Muslim friends have told me to do, which is please don't talk about the Saudi ideology when it comes to Islam as a version of Islam. Talk about it as a perversion of Islam, because it has nothing to do with the kind of Islam that is practiced by the vast, vast majority of people around the world, which is a loving, compassionate form of Islam. And so for that reason, I've been encouraged by people in the Muslim community to speak out, to write this book. And I realized in doing so also that many of the people who are part of the peace movement know so little about Saudi Arabia. And so the book I wrote is really kind of a basic primer. It's sort of a 101, what you need to know about Saudi Arabia. And it's important to step back for a minute and look at the foundation of this regime, which goes back to the 1700s when there was a figure who I consider a cult-like figure, Mohammed Wahhab, who had his fundamentalist, intolerant version of the Quran and said that if you don't interpret it the way that I do, then you are an infidel and it's okay to go around and kill infidels. Well, this turned out to be very convenient for the Saud family that wanted to go around conquering Mecca and Medina, the Holy Lands, and use this ideology as a justification for doing that. We can't go back in history, but when the kingdom was declared a nation in 1932, I would say that this nation would not have lasted for a long time, that it would have been overthrown by its own people, it would have been overthrown by people from the outside, had it not been for the discovery of oil. And there we have to look at the role of the United States and the Westerners for keeping this regime intact. In fact, there's a very famous meeting between Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1945 during World War II and the King of Saudi Arabia. And basically, FDR said, not in these exact words, you, the king, can go about doing what you want inside your own country. We're not going to get involved and tell you how to rule internally, but we're going to make sure that you don't get overthrown. And as long as you keep allowing Western oil companies to come in here and make a lot of money and to export cheap Saudi oil, we're going to guarantee your security. So when you think of Saudi Arabia, think of a family, a Saudi family, and how that kingdom has been passed down from founder to son to son to son to son. Now they're at the last remaining son that can basically get out of bed. They're going to have to figure out the succession after that. But were it not for the U.S., this kingdom would not exist. This one family, this Saud family, would not be today among the family of nations because it is not a modern nation in the sense of how we're supposed to govern these days. And it was important, I think, to look at those slides to get a sense of what this kingdom is like. This is a kingdom where there are no such things as free speech, free assembly, freedom of association. You know, we hear a lot about Iran, and there's plenty of things to criticize about Iran, but in the U.S. government and the congressional hearings that I go to quite often, they're always talking about Iran spreading terrorism and Iran not being a democratic country and Iran not having free and fair elections. And I always have to say, well, what are you talking about? There aren't even elections in Saudi Arabia on the national level, much less free and fair elections. There's no election for a president. There's no election for assembly or a Congress. And why don't we hear our leaders talking about that? We saw on the slides some of the atrocities of the Saudi regime. For example, the use of the death penalty, the use of executions by beheading, even this term crucifixion, which when I first heard it, I said, what are they talking about? And realized it's a gruesome Saudi cutting off of the head and then posting the victim for several days in a public square as a, quote, warning to the rest of the population. You wonder where ISIS gets some of its gruesome practices from. Much of that comes from Saudi Arabia itself. You see that people like Raif Badawi, who was sentenced to 10 years in prison and 1,000 lashes, was sentenced because he was writing blogs about wanting to question the role of religion in the government, question why can't we be a more open society, and for that he was originally given the death penalty. There are many non-violent reasons for which one could be executed in Saudi Arabia, and that includes insulting the kingdom, spreading atheism, being a homosexual. They even have one category about being a sorcerer. So many reasons that one could be given the death penalty or long prison sentences. We also understand that there are large segments of the population in Saudi Arabia that are discriminated against, for example, women. When you think of Saudi women, you probably think that women can't drive, which is true. In fact, it's the only country in the world where women are not allowed to drive. Many people, when they think of Saudi Arabia, thinking of the forced covering of women in public. But what's most important to understand about women in Saudi Arabia is the guardianship system that says from the time a girl is born till the time the woman dies, they have to have a male who is the legal guardian who decides whether the woman can make the key decisions in her life, like who to marry, when to marry, what to study, what kind of job to get, if she can get a passport, if she can travel. And if that woman has an enlightened guardian, she can have quite a good life in Saudi Arabia. But if that woman has a backward, repressive guardian, her life can be hell. And that is why there are thousands of women who recently took a very courageous stand of signing a petition saying they wanted to see a lifting of the guardianship system. There are other entire sectors of the population that are discriminated against, and we saw that in some of the slides as well. You might think, as I naively thought at one time, that if there is a country like Saudi Arabia that's based on a theocracy, they might have respect for people's religion. But that is not the case. It is only if you have respect for the Wahhabi Sunni version of religion that is respected. But if you are, for example, a Sufi that wants to practice Islam in a very different kind of way, you will be discriminated against. Certainly, if you are of the minority Shia population that lives mostly in the eastern part of the country where the oil is. So you would think that they would be the richest, the ones who would benefit the most from this regime. But no, that is not the case. They are discriminated against, and very harshly, when they do things like try to rise up, as they have periodically tried to do. There are also many non-Muslims who live in Saudi Arabia. In fact, there are millions of non-Muslims who live in Saudi Arabia, and that is because there is such a large foreign labor force. So there are about 2 million Christians in Saudi Arabia. They are not allowed to have a public place of worship. It is illegal in Saudi Arabia to build a church. In fact, it's illegal to build any non-Muslim place of worship. And you would think that that would be something of concern to many of the Christians in the United States, many of whom are actually elected congresspeople in our government. Well, it turns out our government has passed a law back in 1998 called the International Freedom of Religion Act. And it says that every year we're going to study those countries that are not tolerant of people's right to exercise their freedom of religion, and we're going to put them in a category called countries of concern, and we will sanction those countries. Well, every year the study's done, and every year North Korea, country of concern, sanctions. Every year Burma, country of concern, sanctions. Every year Saudi Arabia, country of concern, no sanctions. No sanctions. Why? I discovered in writing the book that in 2004, the State Department placed a waiver on Saudi Arabia, and it's an indefinite waiver. It doesn't even have to be renewed any year. It's giving Saudi Arabia a free pass against our own laws. So I mentioned that there is a large migrant labor force. It is actually a huge migrant labor force. Of the 30 million people that live in Saudi Arabia, 10 million of them are foreigners. Now, some of them, most of them are coming from very poor countries like India, Bangladesh, the Philippines. And they're coming to make money to send back home to their families. Well, first of all, you can't just say, I'm going to go to Saudi Arabia and see what kind of job I can get. No, you have to have a sponsor. So you get to Saudi Arabia already having paid a recruitment fee that you then have to pay back. You have a sponsor who basically owns you. Just like in the guardianship system, you might be lucky and get a good sponsor who treats you well, pays you what they said they would pay you. But you might very well get a really nasty sponsor who works you 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, doesn't pay you what they said they would pay you, abuses you, even sexual abuse if you're a domestic worker. And what if you say, this is not what I bargained for, I want to go back home? You can't do that because you need a visa, and the only one who can issue you that visa is your employer. So this is like a modern-day form of slavery. In fact, slavery was not abolished in Saudi Arabia until 1962. So here you have a country that oppresses entire segments of the population, even has something called the religious police that enforce a lot of this. It's not only something that is done internally. Saudi Arabia is spreading its ideology around the world. This is actually quite a relatively new phenomena that happened after the 1979 revolution in Iran, when Iran, a Shia country, said, we are the guardians of Islam, we have the true version, and the Saudis said, wait a minute, ours is, and we will go spread it around, and started using a lot of the petrodollars to build thousands of mosques and schools all over the world. I remember being in Palestine, being in the West Bank and sitting in a cafe, and a man from Palestine saying to me, you see that mosque over there? Saudis built it. You see the mosque over there, Saudis built it. You see the mosque over there, Saudis built it. We have so many other needs. Why do they keep building more and more and more mosques? And they've been doing that in so many places around the world. And you see, as President Obama even said, who lived at one time in Egypt, the largest Muslim country, where there is a very tolerant, loving version of Islam that's practiced, he said you saw when the Saudis came in, where they had their influence, the creeping extremism that came with the influence of Saudi Arabia. Now, we were told by our government that they were, quote, working with the Saudis to try to stop the extremist element, but that unfortunately the government just couldn't control its own clerics, its own people. And to a certain extent that is true. But what we've seen from WikiLeaks cables that have been released recently, our government knew it wasn't just random Saudis that were supporting extremist groups. It was the government of Saudi Arabia, supporting groups like Al-Qaeda branches in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, and even supporting ISIS, as we see from a 2014 cable that was recently released. We have cables that show Hillary Clinton saying, "What are we going to do about the Saudis? They keep funding these extremist groups." Well, she actually had the power to do something about it as Secretary of State. Unfortunately, what she did was ask for funding for her foundation, the Clinton Foundation. The U.S. government has, at some point you have to sit back and say, how could it be that our government has been spending trillions of our tax dollars, the lives of our soldiers, destroying the lives of many people in so many Muslim countries, all in the name of fighting extremism, while at the same time we are this major ally of the country that is most responsible for spreading extremism around the world. You have to really start looking at this mind-boggling fact. Well, I said that one of the reasons is oil, and certainly, even though the U.S. gets a lot less of its oil these days from Saudi Arabia, about 12%, oil is still a key factor. The Saudis have used a lot of the petrodollars to invest in the U.S. economy, giving them leverage. For example, investing in hundreds of billions of dollars in treasury bonds, buying up a lot of U.S. companies, including oil refineries in Texas, real estate. They talk about bailing Donald Trump out twice. They have invested in companies like Uber, $3.5 billion invested in Uber that gave them a seat on the Uber board, which is quite ironic given that half the population in Saudi Arabia can't drive. They've given money lavishly to think tanks on the left, on the right, in between, liberal ones like the Atlantic Council, like the Brookings Institute. Also quite ironic, they give to think tanks because you could not have such a think tank in Saudi Arabia. They also give money to a lot of U.S. universities. You might see entire wings of some universities with thanks to this prince or that prince. In fact, I was recently at the Yale Law School where they had gotten $10 million from a Saudi, and we went and visited them and said, do you think it's quite ironic that the Yale Law School is funded by Saudis when there is no rule of law in Saudi Arabia? The Saudis also have employed now about 10 different PR and law firms to represent them in Washington, D.C. These firms have to be registered with the U.S. government as foreign agents, and they are full of former congresspeople. They are full of former people high up in the U.S. military. One of these groups is called the Podesta Group, which you might have heard of. Started originally by two brothers, Tony and John Podesta. John Podesta left to run Hillary Clinton's campaign. Tony Podesta stayed behind. He became a paid foreign agent of the Saudi government, getting $140,000 every month to represent the Saudi government. In addition to all of this, and perhaps what has become the biggest factor in the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, is that Saudi Arabia has become by far the largest purchaser of U.S. weapons. The amount of weapon sales to Saudi Arabia is mind-boggling. We have never sold such vast sums of weapons to any country before. And just under the Obama administration, we have sold $115 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia. Just let that sink in a little bit. I know it's sometimes hard when you talk about these big numbers, but that is a massive amount of weapons. Saudi Arabia right now is propping up the U.S. military-industrial complex. And what are they doing with those weapons? Repressing their own people, going into neighboring countries, like during the Arab Spring. They did not want to see democratic movements prevail in the neighborhood, went into Bahrain, where there was a beautiful, non-violent uprising among the population. Using U.S. tanks, came in and crushed that uprising. I mentioned that the weapons can now be found with al-Qaeda groups in Syria and Libya and Iraq. But also, the weapons are now being used to devastate an already very poor country in the Middle East, and that is Yemen. And this is something that our media does not cover enough. This is something that the American people barely even understand, that now it's going on 20 months since the Saudis got involved in an internal conflict in Yemen because they worried that one side, the Houthis, was close to Iran and this would give Iran a foothold next door. And they went in there, and like George Bush when he went into Iraq thought it would be quick and dirty. Well, it hasn't been. It's been very dirty. It has not been quick. It has been 20 months now. And I said that Yemen was already a very poor country. You look at what the United Nations is now saying. It is a catastrophic situation, not only with thousands and thousands of innocent people being killed, mostly by the bombings, but also because of the destruction of the infrastructure. Millions of children severely malnourished right now, facing famine in Yemen. There is an outbreak of cholera because the water system has been destroyed and because so many medical facilities have been destroyed. There was a study done that said a third of the targets have been civilian targets. So marketplaces, schools, residential neighborhoods, factories, wedding parties, funerals. And this is all not only with U.S. weapons, it's with U.S. logistical support. It's with U.S. refueling of the planes in the air. It's with U.S. help in targeting. It's with U.S. diplomatic cover. And that's why many Yemenis are now saying this is a U.S. war and the American people have blood on their hands. And we have to understand that this is not only criminal for the people of Iraq, but it is also something that is going to blow back and affect our national security for a long time to come. I said that there have been $115 billion worth of weapon sales. There have been 42 different deals during the Obama administration. Now, Congress has the legal ability to stop weapon sales if it wanted to. Every one of those weapon sales, Congress did nothing. It was only because of the devastation in Yemen that some of our Congress people have started to speak up. And I want to applaud those who have done that, like Chris Murphy, the senator from Connecticut, like Rand Paul, a Republican from Kentucky, and they said, finally, enough is enough. And they forced a vote inside the Congress in the Senate, the first time that we have had such a vote in the Senate. You would think that 100 senators would say, of course, we don't want to sell weapons to this repressive regime. Unfortunately, it wasn't 100. It was 27 of them. It is a beginning. Barbara Boxer voted the right way. Dianne Feinstein voted the wrong way. I have flyers over there. I would hope that one thing you might do after this talk is make a call to Senator Feinstein's office and tell her no weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. So I mentioned that Saudi Arabia is propping up the military-industrial complex. We are in a Muslim place of worship right now that prides itself on being interfaith. And that is so important these days. And one person of faith whose name I want to bring into the room is Pope Francis. And I want to do that because Pope Francis came to speak before Congress. And among the things he said, some wonderful things he said, was he talked about weapons. And he said, why are we selling weapons to people who use them in such an abusive way? The answer, he said, is money. It's money that is drenched in blood, he said. And we are complicit if we don't speak out. We are complicit if we don't stand up to the arms industry. He said this in front of Congress, and a bunch of Congress members got up and started clapping, which I found quite ironic. Because the weapons industry is very clever, and they make weapons in every single congressional district. And then they give money to those Congress people for their re-election campaigns, and then those Congress people say, we couldn't possibly stop weapons sales to these countries or stop the production of a weapons system, sometimes even ones that the Pentagon doesn't want, because these represent jobs in my community. Well, this is complicity. This is corruption. This is something that we, as a public, who wants to see our government represent our values, we have to stand up not only to the arms industry, but to the people in Congress, the people who are in the White House, the people who are complicit with us selling weapons to such repressive regimes as Saudi Arabia. So that is one major takeaway I want you to take with you from this talk. The other thing is to recognize that there are, as we saw in the slides, really courageous Saudis who are trying to change their own government. Some of them have already been executed. Some of them are rotting away in Saudi prisons. But many of them are looking for other means to challenge the Saudi regime. And the Saudis that I have been talking to say, we are really afraid with the government not giving the ability to make changes for the better inside Saudi Arabia, we are going to see the violent people who want to overthrow the regime take over. And things could be a lot worse than they are now, because there is no civil society to fill the void. Who would take over? Armed groups, groups like Al-Qaeda, groups like ISIS. And that's why they say we need reforms desperately so people start seeing that some change is possible. I mentioned that women had signed petitions calling for a lifting of the guardianship system. We know there are people in the Shia community who only want to be treated like equal citizens. We know that there are professors and academics who are trying to meet with some of the more forward-thinking princes and say, look, you know, we are living in an absolute monarchy, but there are other kinds of monarchies in other parts of the world. Even in Great Britain, they have a monarchy, and people love their kings and queens, and they have a ceremonial function. We need to have a constitutional monarchy. Let's move towards that as an opening for reform. These are the people that our government should be supporting. But unfortunately, whether it has been a Republican or a Democrat in office, they have been supporting the regime instead of supporting the real Democrats. So I say, as we look forward, we have a lot of things to do with a new administration, and I hope in the discussion session we can get into that. But let's recognize that the power of the military-industrial complex and the power of big oil have kept us in this relationship with the Saudi regime. And this is something that we have to find a way to unite among people of different faiths, to unite among people of different ethnicities, to unite among people left or right, because this is not a left or right issue. In fact, sometimes it is easier to talk to conservative Republicans about this than it is to some liberal Democrats. So let's think of this as one issue that we can work towards uniting people to say that it is way more important that we support democracy around the world, that we get ourselves off of the fossil fuel treadmill so we might have a future in this beautiful planet we live on, than it is to be supporting these monarchs that have been holding on to power for so many decades. So I hope, as we try to strengthen our own democratic process that we have seen to be so corrupt and seen to be so tainted during this last election period, we also try to change the foreign policy that has made us more of an arms dealer around the world than a peacemaker. So let's say power to the peaceful at home and abroad. That's what we need. That's where we're going. Let's do it. Thank you.
All right, everybody. So now we have a... Sorry, I thought the microphone was on, but I'm loud. That was awesome, wasn't it? All right, if you have a question in a nice, peaceful manner, maybe if we can form a line over here, make your questions, to the point, focalized, no speeches, and then we can have some time for question and answer. Maybe we'll spend about 15 or so minutes doing that, and then we will start the line for book signings over here if you've already bought your book. If you haven't, we have about 11 more copies, and that's it. And then you can get it later on, but it won't be signed. So if you have any questions, please make your way up here. And I'm sorry, we're going to keep the microphone stationary because it is being filmed, so we do need to make it stationary.
My question has to do with the recent...
Closer?
It has to do with the most recent passing of a law in which Americans can sue Saudi Arabia. Could you explain your outlook on that?
So this is a law called JASTA. It's a law that the 9/11 family members have been fighting for the last 15 years. They want to know how high up the chain was the complicity of the Saudi government in the 9/11 attacks. We know that 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis, but we don't know who else was involved in it. So the law that was passed was quite amazing. It happened on the 15th anniversary of the 9/11 attack. It happened during an election period. And unfortunately, President Obama, after it was passed, vetoed the law. He said that this would give a bad precedent to other countries. He didn't use these words, but basically that said that might want to sue us for war crimes that we commit in their countries. But amazingly, Congress overrode that veto. So now there is a lot of pressure from the Saudi government on Congress people. These lobbyists that I talked about are not only going to people at the national level, they're going to the local level, to governors, to state assemblies, to say, we might pull out our money, and this would be very bad for the U.S. economy. You should have a redo of that. We don't know what's going to happen when Congress comes back. We hope they will hold firm and that these lawsuits can go ahead, because this might be the only way that not only the 9/11 families, but we, the American public, can get hold of tens of thousands of documents that our government has from FBI investigations that can tell us a lot more information that we should have the right to know.
Thank you again for the presentation. I was really interested in the destruction of the holy sites, the presentation that Reza had mentioned or provided. I think it's kind of ironic that the idea that the Saudi culture wants to expand its version of Islam and building, you mentioned, new mosques throughout the world, but then at the same time destroying its own holy sites in Saudi Arabia. Do you have any rationale behind that? It just seemed like kind of contradictory. So, thank
Reza,
you.
why don't you come up and explain that?
Actually, we have can I throw
Yes.
deflect it to our
Please.
Imam, Sayyid Ali? Please say it.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum and peace be with you. Well, it's part of the Wahhabi ideology is to destroy any significant building or a heritage that reflects other ideologies, faith. So examples, museums, graveyards that are built into a shrine and people would go and respect. They believe this is something against the faith and this is worshipping a rock or a place instead of God. So this is their mentality. And by the way,
excuse me, Umar.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, they're breaking into our cars outside. Some cars have been broken into. They haven't taken anything. Must be some kind of a hate crime. So maybe we can take a 5-minute pause. Please go and check your cars and come back. Lots of cars have been broken into.
All right. Wow. Sorry to break that.
Yeah.
All right. We are waiting for you. We'll take 2 more questions and then we'll conclude.
Can we make? I'm going to make sure he's filming, and you should say something about it.
All right. I already said. All right.
You should say that.
All right. Again, I would like to repeat what happened while we were listening to Medea Benjamin talking about the situation in Saudi Arabia and the relationship with the United States. Unfortunately, few cars were breaking in and few items were also stolen. I think at least as far as I know, 3 cars, including Medea cars. So this makes me really wonder who knows her car and attack it. And anyway, by the way, we called the police about 20 minutes ago, and we expect them to show up any minute.
If I may say,
Yes.
I got lost coming here, and they were about a block away.
The police.
I stopped and asked them for directions.
All right. So we'll take 2 more questions, and I do apologize for what happened, and really appreciate your time staying here. We'll take 2 more questions, and we'll end the session. Thank you very much. All right. Yes, there is a question.
Yeah, I just want to say something before we go to the questions. This is not new. This has been happening to Islamic centers, to mosques, for a long time now. But this is what we're going to face more often now, because the Donald Trump campaign and now the presidency has given a green light to hate. And I want to say just how sorry I feel to you and to the wonderful people of this Islamic Cultural Center that constantly are opening up this center to dialogue, to discussions about love and compassion and how we work together, how we appreciate the human family and the beautiful bouquet that we are. And to be targeted is such a violation of all of the values that we want to stand for as a nation. I feel violated. Everything in my car was taken. And I feel more violated for the people who run this center, who have to now face this on perhaps an even more regular basis. And I hope that as part of the discussion we have after this formal part, we talk about how we form rings of solidarity, how we protect our mosques, how we protect our brothers and sisters, how we protect the Muslim community, how we protect the Latino community, the immigrant community, the gay community, how we protect all the people who will unfortunately be even more victimized than they have been. So this is not a pretty immediate future that we face. On the other hand, I do want to say that I've never seen such an outpouring of objection as we've seen since the election happened. And this is coming particularly from young people who say, this is not the future that I want. So whether Donald Trump is going to get out there and say hate speech is bad, attacking mosques is wrong, attacking immigrants is wrong, we need to be out there saying it loud and clear. And not just saying it, we have to form ways of making sure it happens. I remember right after 9/11, I lived in San Francisco, one of the most progressive parts of this country. There was an attack on our neighborhood grocer because he was a Muslim. You know what we did? We slept in his grocery store. Night after night after night, we slept there. We said, we will not let this happen in our community. And we started printing up no hate zone signs, and we put them all over the place. You know what? We're going to have to go back to that again. That's what we're going to have to do. So let this be a warning. Let this be a signal. Let this be not a call to feel, maybe we've got to not do some of this work, just the opposite. Let this really invigorate us to recognize what's happening in this country, what's happening to our brothers and sisters who are most victimized by the hatred that's been going on for way too long. And let's make a pledge tonight that we will stand up for everybody who is being unfairly victimized, that we will stand up against hate, against misogyny, against Islamophobia, against anti-immigrant sentiments, that we will do more than we've done, that we will do all we can do, that we will use this evening to remember what it's like to be targeted and what the appropriate response is, not only calling the police, but calling on the community to come out here. And I think it would be a beautiful thing if we got the permission of the imam to call on the community to come out here tomorrow in massive numbers to show their love for the center and to show that we will not be intimidated and that we are unified around love.
Thank you very much for focusing the whole argument and discussion. Just towards the end of your presentation, you made a very wonderful comment saying that this is not just a question of protesting, it's a question of getting and working with both sides, Republicans, Democrats, and everyone together. Sort of a thought flashes across my mind that we are all saying we need to work with Donald. I think here's an opportunity to get him to focus on where the terrorism is really coming from. So we can help him to differentiate between Muslims and this particular aversion that is considered to be somehow ridiculously related to Islam. And therefore, I'm wondering what we can do working with our representatives, with our congressmen, and forcing them to focus Trump's energy towards what you were calling oppose Saudi Arabia and its positions. And how can we move into the legislative process? Agitation and all is good and important, but I'm thinking we need to get inside the White House, and how do we do that?
So there are some things that Donald Trump has said on the campaign that are positive. For example, have a better relationship with Russia is extremely important because we don't want to go to war with Russia. Having him say that the attack on Iraq was a horrible mistake and that the Bush administration knew that there were no weapons of mass destruction and lied to the American people is an important thing to hear. Donald Trump has said that the Saudis are the most responsible for spreading extremism around the world. Let's hold him to that. So I agree. We have to see if there are ways that we can work with both sides, that we can force another vote in Congress, and get both of our senators from this great state of California to vote the right way, if we can push whoever is in the White House to look, as you say, of where a lot of the source of terrorism is coming from. But let's also recognize that Donald Trump has said some really terrible things. And he said that torture is okay. He has said it's okay to kill the families of suspected terrorists as a warning. He's talked about the expansion of our military, and he's talked about the need for further, after having said that Israel and Palestine, he was going to be neutral, he turned around and said no, that he was going to make the Jerusalem, recognize Jerusalem being the capital and move the U.S. Embassy there, that settlements should keep on going. So he has said a lot of contradictory things. And we don't know what we're working with and who we're working with. We know that the stocks for the weapons manufacturing sector went soaring after Donald Trump won. And that is not a good sign.
Okay, I'm Jim Walton, Chair Emeritus of the English Department of Fresno State. I heard you on the radio today. I want to express my sorrow, first of all, for your loss tonight, and thank you for your expression of concern. Okay. My question relates to something I heard on the radio today, and you touched on it tonight, perhaps. Well, you touched on quite a bit today on the radio. You know, one person received 2 million votes more than another person, but because of a system we have in our country where at one time the rich landowners voted for a system, I wonder how many women voted at the time, how many folks who like me voted. We're all impacted by that decision, women, people who look like me and others. I wonder if at some time you can perceive a different climate where those who are women, those who look like me, might vote to deal with this thing called the Electoral College, and simply in a democracy let the person who gets the most votes take over, and maybe we wouldn't have the situation we're facing today. Thank you.
Certainly our democracy is not one I would wish on other countries. There is no reason to have an electoral college. It should be abolished. There is no reason in the parties to have superdelegates. That should be abolished. There is no reason to have voter suppression, long lines. Even where I live inside of Washington, D.C., the lines were so long, I had to come back 3 times in order to be able to vote. Elections should be a holiday. There should be a system where it is not a winner-take-all, but a representative system where you get, if you get 5% of the votes for Congress, you get 5% of the seats. There should be third parties that have access to the debates so that people can hear what they stand for. The debates should not be organized and run by the 2 parties themselves. We should get money out of politics. You can't have a democracy with this corruption of moneyed influence in politics. There are so many things we need to change about our system to hold our heads up high and say we believe in and we recognize the model of democracy that we have. So I saw this happen in 2000 with Al Gore, and I thought things were really going to change. And now it's happened again. And you know what? We can't wait for the leadership of the Democratic Party because they seem to go along with this stuff. It really has to come from us, from the grassroots. I'm delighted that there's now petitions out there to abolish the Electoral College that have millions of people signing on. And I hope we bring that energy to Washington, D.C., to the Democratic Party, to the Republican Party, and force some of these fundamental changes in our system.
Before the next question, I know good people roll together, so I'm hoping one of you guys can help me. Does anybody here know how to get a hold of Judith Dickey?
And who is she?
She is one of our ladies who was here tonight. And I have her money and wallet. that was thrown out of her car. In a white car?
Yeah.
Do you know her?
No.
Her money and wallet was thrown out of her car.
I know her name.
So maybe we can investigate that more after, but let's go for our yeah.
I'm Daniel O'Connell. Thank you for coming. Years ago, as a student at the University of California, Edward Seyed came to speak, and there was repeated bomb threats that day. It told me and signaled to me the veracity of what he was about to tell us. And
What year was that in?
I'm getting old, you know. 88, 89. I just wanted to tell my fellow Fresnans, this is the first time I'm blessed to come to the Islamic Center here. The importance that this event has shown me is that this is a very unique place. I already knew Medea by reputation. And I wanted to, in particular, comment to the white people here, the white middle-class people, not to choose the self-help of assimilation for what's coming. We now, when you see something like this means you huddle in next to this organization more. And as we have attacks on undocumented...
We have one more. Are we going to do one more? Or two more? No, there's one gentleman here. Okay, we have our final two questions. Are you going to ask a question? No, I don't. All right, we have our final question, and then Seyed Ali.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Robert Pathod. I just wanted you to expand a little bit on something you said in your talk this evening. You said at one point that sometimes it's easier to talk to conservatives than progressives about these matters, and I was wondering what line of reasoning you use that appeals especially to conservatives.
We have been going up to many of the very religious Christians in Congress, and with my Saudi friends, and in fact a very brave Saudi woman who goes up to them whenever we point them out, and she goes up and she says, "Sir, are you a good Christian?" And he says, "Of course." And she says, "Then why are you selling weapons to the only country in the world where it is illegal to build a church?" And that kind of leaves them a little dumbfounded. And then she says, "Might I come to your office and talk to you a bit more about this? Can I set up a meeting with your scheduler?" And so we've been doing that. And it's very important to do, and we don't know how well it works because we haven't had a vote again. But I think this is an issue where we show the hypocrisy, and we put people on the spot, and we make it a personal kind of thing. So that is one example of the kind of approach we've been using.
Sorry, if I may. One question, sorry.
Yeah.
This question is about Israel-Palestine, if I can ask that. I know it deviates somewhat. Many people have compared the situation in the West Bank and Gaza Strip to apartheid in South Africa. I was recently watching an interview with Noam Chomsky in which he stated that he considered many of those claims to be dubious. I'm not sure why he said that, but I'm wondering whether you consider that an apt comparison.
Many of the Palestinians I work with use that comparison, and I appreciate using that kind of language because I think that is something that wakes people up to the gravity of the situation and actually want to learn more about it. And the fact that many of the conservative Jewish groups in this country are so opposed to it is also indicative that this really gets to people. I think it's quite marvelous that the Black Lives Matter platform has used the word apartheid and went even further and used the word genocide. And that made many people in the more conservative Jewish community in the United States extremely angry, caused a rift between some of them, and the Black Lives Matter folks stood their ground. And they said, this is how we see it, and many of us have actually been to Palestine. We've seen it with our own eyes. We've come back and we're speaking our truth. So I think we have to use words that reflect the gravity of the situation and make people reflect on why we are using those words. So in closing, I just want to say a great thank you to the mosque, to the cultural center, to the people who opened up this space for us, and that this is a night that is very profound and very sad. And I will not leave here without talking to you about what we can do to show our extreme sorrow for what happened tonight, not as individuals who lost our stuff, but as a community that's been violated, and what we can do to work with you in the future. And I'm happy to keep coming back and sleep on the floor right here if need be, because I love you and I want to spread that love. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just would like to add one more sentence. A few decades ago, the apartheid regime in South Africa was an ally of United States with a good relationship. With social work, with awareness, the situation changed and people of South Africa got their freedom. This is what we need to do with Saudi Arabia, with the work that Medea is leading, and focusing on the fact that terrorism is actually is being created and supported by the Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia. And unfortunately, because of their alliance, because of their power in United States, they are continuing to target Muslims, non-Muslims, Americans, Europeans, and everywhere. We need Medea work to change the situation and let the world know. So within a few years, we'll see freedom and democracy in Saudi Arabia. Thank you, Medea, for awareing us and bringing this issue to the stage throughout United States and through media. You have our support. And I would like, again, to apologize for what happened. But for me, this is more important. Another fact that I would like to share with you, the board just informed me that they would like to repay for the damage and the losses she sustained. Out of her generosity and kindness, she is not accepting the payment. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Hopefully we'll see you again and again here. God bless you.
We're at Sun Devil Stadium on the campus of Arizona State University in Tempe.